Today we are going to do some notes on properties of quadrilaterals. So if you guys could title these notes 8.1, Properties of Quadrilaterals, and go ahead and make this sort of outline for your notes. We're going to talk about parallelograms and rectangles first, and we're going to write down their properties, and we're going to directly compare the two because they're very similar. So if you could outline this in a way in your notes that the parallelogram is next to the rectangle, like I did, so that you can kind of compare the two sets of properties, and then leave some space at the bottom for a drawing. This should take about a whole page, maybe a little bit less. Just leave yourself enough room at each number for like a full sentence or a phrase, okay? And then enough room for a drawing at the bottom. So pause the video, go ahead and make that outline. And then the second outline you're going to make is going to look like this, very similar. You're going to put a rhombus on one side next to a square on the other side. You're going to leave 8 spots for 8 rhombus properties and 10 spots for 10 square properties, and then some space for a drawing at the bottom for each of those. So go ahead and pause the video and make that outline as well. That should take about at least half a page, maybe a whole page as well. Just leave yourself some room to take notes, and we'll get started. All right, we can move on to go back to the parallelogram. There's 6 properties of a parallelogram, so just take a second to write these down. You can pause the video and then listen to what I say afterwards, or listen to what I say and then take the notes. Just make sure you understand these properties as we go. So the sum of all the angles in a parallelogram add up to 360 degrees. The opposite sides of a parallelogram are parallel. The opposite sides are also congruent to each other, which means they're the same size and length. The opposite angles are congruent to each other, and we'll draw a picture to show all these things. The diagonals bisect each other, so both diagonals cut each other in half. And any pair of consecutive angles are supplementary. Consecutive angles are 2 angles right next to each other in a parallelogram, so we will talk about that as well. So you can write those down, and then you can also add this drawing at the bottom. So this is the drawing for the parallelogram. You can see how opposite sides are parallel to each other. The top and the bottom have 1 arrow, which means those 2 are parallel. And then the sides have 2 arrows, which means those 2 are parallel to each other, but not parallel to the first lines. Okay, and then you can also see that opposite angles are congruent. So you see how Y and W are congruent, so they get 1 arc, and then X and Z are congruent, so they get 2 arcs. And then opposite sides are also congruent, and the diagonals bisect each other, so you need to put those double lines there on one diagonal and the single lines on another, meaning that they cut each other in half. It does not mean that all 4 segments are congruent. It just means one diagonal is cut in half and another diagonal is cut in half. Okay, and then that stuff on the side needs to be added to your drawing as well. So write down X plus Y plus Z plus W. All of those add up to 360, all 4 angles. And then W plus X, look at W and X. Those are consecutive angles. Those are the 2 next to each other, and they're going to add up to 180. Okay? X plus Y is also consecutive to each other. They're right next to each other in the parallelogram, so they're going to add up to 180. Y plus Z are also next to each other, so they add up to 180, and W plus Z equals 180 as well. So write all that out. Those supplementary angles correspond to step 6 of a parallelogram, property number 6. Any pair of consecutive angles are supplementary. All right, and then the next thing we're going to talk about is a rectangle. So go ahead and write down these 8 rectangle properties while I go over them. And you can also draw this picture as well. So rectangles, if you compare it to the parallelogram as you go, you'll see that almost all of them are the same. Rectangle just has some extra ones. So number 1 is the same as a parallelogram. The sum of all the angles is 360. Opposite sides are parallel, just like a parallelogram. Opposite sides are congruent, just like a parallelogram. Opposite angles are congruent. The diagonals bisect each other. Any pair of consecutive angles are supplementary. Okay, so numbers 1 through 6 are the same as a parallelogram. So basically a rectangle and a parallelogram are the same, except a rectangle has 2 extra properties at the bottom. These are 7 and 8. All angles are right angles, and the diagonals are congruent. Okay, we kind of know that. We know that all the angles in a rectangle are right angles. They're 90 degrees. Okay, and the diagonals are congruent, which makes sense with the 90 degrees, with the 90 degree thing. Okay, so go ahead and sketch that picture as well down at the bottom. It's a rectangle. If you put it, if you draw the drawing down in the drawing section, you can compare it to a parallelogram, which they look very similar, except the difference is the 90 degree angles. Okay, and you can make those diagonals, not only is a diagonal cut in half, but also those are going to be the same length as the other diagonal cut in half. So that's why they all get one single dash to show that the diagonals are congruent. Okay, and then you can put that angle x plus angle y plus angle z plus angle w all add up to 360 degrees. So add that in there as well, which makes sense because if each of those things are 90, 90 times 4 is 360. Okay, so your notes for this should look something like this. You should have compared, put your parallelogram notes on one side and your rectangle notes on the other, and they should be comparable to each other. So almost all of these match up, except a rectangle gets 2 extra properties. Okay, so that is why we set it up that the parallelogram is next to the rectangle, so you can compare them. All right, next we're going to move on to the rhombus square notes. So you should have this outline written in your notes, rhombus square. And then we're going to go ahead and do those. So a rhombus, here's your rhombus. A rhombus is very similar to a parallelogram as well. It has a sum of all of its angles are 360. The opposite sides are parallel, just like a parallelogram. Instead of just opposite sides being congruent, in this case, all sides are congruent in a rhombus. Okay? Opposite angles are congruent. The diagonals bisect each other. Any pair of consecutive angles are supplementary, just like a parallelogram. Remember, consecutive is angles right next to each other. The diagonals are perpendicular to each other. That's a new property. And the diagonals form angle bisectors. Okay, so when you draw this picture of a rhombus here, this diagram, you need to mark it up just like it's marked here. You need to make sure that the diagonals are perpendicular to each other. That's why there's a 90 degree symbol in the middle there. That's why there's a square there. You need to make sure that opposite angles are congruent. That's why X and Z each have a single arch, and W and Y have 2. Because W and Y are equal to each other. And then opposite sides are parallel, so that's what the arrows show. And not only are opposite sides congruent, but all sides are congruent, so they all get one single dash. Okay, and then you can say that you can show that any pair of consecutive angles is supplementary by saying that x plus y equals 180. You could also write that out for all of them. You could do y plus z, those are going to add up to 180. Z plus w is going to add up to 180. W plus x is going to add up to 180, as long as the 2 angles are consecutive, aka next to each other. All right, and then a square. This one needs 10 properties. So it's going to be very similar. You're going to write the properties next to the rhombus's properties, and you're going to compare them. They're going to be very similar. The sum of all the angles is 360. Opposite sides are parallel. All sides are congruent in a square. All angles are congruent. Okay, that's different. That's every single angle is going to be congruent to each other. The diagonals bisect each other. Any pair of consecutive angles are supplementary. Okay, so those are all very similar to rhombus's properties up to this point. Number 7, all angles are right angles. Okay, that's similar to a rectangle. The diagonals are congruent. That's like a rectangle. Okay, Diagonals bisect each other. Okay, so we're going to skip that one that's crossed out because that's already said above. Diagonals bisect each other, and diagonals are perpendicular bisectors of each other. So go ahead and draw this square down here. Make sure you understand all the different parts that are being written in there. Okay, so that opposite sides are parallel. That's what the orange arrows are for. All sides are congruent, not just opposite sides, so they all have a single purple dash. Diagonals are congruent to each other and they bisect each other, so that's why they each have a single blue dash in there. And the middle is, the two diagonals are perpendicular to each other, that's why there's a 90-degree symbol in there. And all of the angles are also 90 degrees, and they add up to 360 together. So the square is the most perfect. It has all of the properties of the other ones, really. It really does, plus more. Okay, and this is the first half of the notes. Now we have a couple other quadrilaterals to talk about.